Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Stop Far-Right seminar. This is the fourth seminar in our series, and today's topic is far-right and racism in Ireland. Stop Far-Right is an Irish Research Council funded project led by Bryan Fanning in the Department of Sociology at Maynooth, and it's being organized in association with the Crosscare Migrant Project. The project aims to promote discussion and debate between academics and civil society groups on how best to counter-strategize against the growth of the far right in Ireland. As part of its activities, Stop Far-Right is holding this series of online seminars with leading Irish and international academics and civil society members working on the theme of resisting the far right. I'm Pranav Kohli, and I'm from the Department of Sociology here in Maynooth. And I'm going to be moderating today's seminar. My own work focuses on race and ethnicity and conflict as well. And I did my doctoral work on the partition of India and how the memories of the partition of India fuel the rise of the far right in Indian politics. Our guests today are Professor Bryan Fanning, Rona McCord, and Gavin Titley. So I'm just gonna introduce the guests now. Professor Bryan Fanning is Professor of Migration and Social Policy at UCD. He describes himself as an academic who studies migration and social policy against the background noise amplified on the internet of xenophobic anxiety and political nativism promoted by some politicians who claim that walls and not bridges will bring us security, stability, and prosperity. I really like that line that he used to introduce himself on his bio, so I just kept it. His research interests also include the modernization of Irish society with a focus on the history of ideas and debates that have shaped its development. He has published extensively on these topics, and his latest book, Three Roads to Welfare State Liberalism, Social Democracy, and Christian Democracy, was published by Policy Press this year. Our second guest is Dr. Rona McCord. Rona is a socialist, trade unionist, historian, and a committed anti-racist and anti-fascist organizer. She currently works for Unite the Union in research, communications, and community development. She is a graduate of Trinity College Dublin, and she's been involved in politics and activism since she was a teenager. She's currently running Unite the Union's Unite's Unity Over Division campaign in the Republic of Ireland, linking in with communities at the grassroots level to build respect for inclusion, equality, and diversity. And our final guest is Dr. Gavin Titley. Gavin is senior lecturer in the Department of Media Studies at Maynooth University. And he's also a docent in the Swedish School of Social Sciences, University of Helsinki. His books include Is Free Speech Racist?, Racism in Media, and After Charlie Hebdo, Terror, Racism, and Free Speech. And he's also published The Crisis of Multiculturalism, Racism in a Neoliberal Age. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us here. We're gonna begin with a 5-minute introductory statement from all of our panelists. And so Bryan, we're gonna come to you first. The floor is yours, Bryan.
Thank you very much, and it's lovely to be with you all today. So I come here basically as somebody who has been researching immigration and its impact on Irish society for about 2 decades now. So that kind of research has 2 angles usually. One is, what are the experiences of immigrants? How are they faring? So it covers issues like racism and discrimination, marginalization. But then the context within which migrants integrate or not, or are excluded or not, or experience racism or otherwise, are shaped by the state and the host society. So a lot of what I've done is also focused on basically Irish responses to immigration. The kinds of research I've done have cut across, a lot of domains, everything from immigrant participation in politics to various social policy themes and so on. And back at an earlier stage, the experience of asylum seekers in direct provision when this was just about beginning. So what I've been interested in recent years, I guess, is trying to make sense of how Ireland is faring and why, if at all, it is different from how other European countries are experiencing the sort of churn of globalization in the era of Trump and others like him. In other words, where far-right populism and nativism does well in mainstream Anglophone democracies. So how, if at all, is Ireland different than this? So I did a book recently that came out early this year called Diverse Republic, and it includes some chapters that focused on the far-right in the context of looking at how Irish society changed and modernized and how immigrants were faring in Irish society. One chapter in particular, which I'd like to say something brief about, was called Far-Right Perspectives. I was quite interested in trying to understand what were the perspectives of the Irish far-right. So this involved basically listening a lot to what they had to say, taking transcripts late at night of many things that would appear online before they were taken down, trying to get a feel for the arguments, the points of view of Irish far-right actors, and trying to make sense of them. In other words, how did they see the world? What was it they were trying to achieve? What wager were they making about what was happening in Irish society and how they could, if you will, manipulate it or benefit from this? So basically, we see that we have a range of different far-right groups in Irish society. And some of these are very much modeled on earlier forms of Irish isolationist nationalism. So in other words, if you look at the YouTube videos of some of these groups, you'll see that the 1916 proclamation features on one side, the Irish flag on another side, and then somebody like Justin Barrett is essentially pretending to be a Patrick Pearse figure. So basically, yeah, so kind of that's kind of, if you will, one style of it. And of course, then there are others too, exemplified by people like John Waters and Gemma O'Doherty, who seem to be waging their own kind of battle with modernity and secularism, and, if you will, the cosmopolitan turn in Irish society as this has played out in recent decades. So these kinds of perspectives are not unusual. You'll find similar ones at play in other countries within which there are far-right groups. They'll either be kind of conservatives, anti-globalists, nationalists of a certain kind. They might be motivated by religious conservatism up to a point. But generally speaking, they're kind of positing that there's a vacuum in politics that they can tap into. And indeed, it looks like that is the case somewhat in Ireland, insofar as that, you know, whilst we can see basically many progressive and modernizing changes in Irish society, such as repealing the eighth or same-sex marriage being won over by significant majorities in constitutions, we can also identify that a significant bunch of people in Ireland are not necessarily happy with this. Less so in the case of the European Union, where, again, a large majority, an even larger majority, is pro-Ireland being in the European Union, but nevertheless, still again, people who are not so happy with this. So the question is, where do they go for politics now that basically most of the political parties are as always in Ireland, singing from a sort of the same hymn sheet that is basically the Irish version of centrism compared to many other countries, looks quite progressive, looks quite cosmopolitan, and so on and so forth. So one of the things I was interested in when I was writing the book was to see, well, were those kinds of arguments gathering traction? And if not, why not, I guess, was something I was trying to best understand for myself. So I won't say any more about that now, but perhaps maybe some of these things will come up naturally in the source of our conversations this afternoon. So I'd like to pass it back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Really interesting stuff, and we're going to be coming back to you with a lot of questions as well. Rona, we're going to hear from you now. So the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invite as well today. It's great to be here to speak on this subject. I guess I just want to say first off that it is a sort of a sensitive subject, and that there are dangers in a lot of the work that we do on the ground at grassroots level when it comes to the far right, because some of the individuals involved are dangerous people and historically have been violent and dangerous towards trade unionists in particular, as well as every other group that they have in their targets. So it's important that what I'm saying here is not very, very specific. It's more broad, just to give you a sort of a flavor of the work that some of the work that the trade union movement does and needs to do in terms of tackling the far right and the growth of the far right and any of that ideology that serves to divide people and divide them in their workplace, because ultimately for us, that's what they are and that's what they represent. They represent a division whereby they can categorize people into groups, and instead of using our solidarity, they divide us, and therefore makes it easier for groups to be exploited. And that always results negatively for working class people, because that's what creates the race to the bottom. If you have one category of people that you can treat differently, whether it be women, children, or migrant labour, then you're always going to set the bar as low as possible. And the bar doesn't rise, it always goes down, and that's the race to the bottom. So division is not good for working class people, not good for our jobs, our health and our conditions. In a sense, I think what we do or try to do as trade unions is pretty much the opposite of what the far right do. The far right try to find division to exploit, and we try to find common ground to unite, to increase our bargaining power, to strengthen ourselves in terms of our rights, our conditions, our jobs, and so on. And because obviously strength is in numbers as far as we're concerned. And historically, that has been the opposite of what fascism, racism, the far right try to do. They try to divide. So just give you a little bit of a taste of what some of the stuff that we've been doing. A few years ago, we launched a campaign in the UK. We're Unite as a union based in the UK and Ireland, Ireland North and South, in all communities, which is a difficult enough thing to do on its own. But we launched a campaign called Unity Over Division a few years ago, and this arose from basically from austerity and Brexit, which were two of the things, the ideologies, if you like, that were being used by the far right and by a number of organisations, particularly in the UK originally, to get into the working class communities effectively, and to capitalise on fear, capitalise on the anger that was there in those communities. Now, ultimately, I'm interested in what Bryan was saying there about political parties, because I think a lot of this stems from the fact that the British Labour Party, and here you could say the same around social democracy, has failed in working class communities, and to some extent has abandoned working class communities and left a gap or a vacuum there for the types of parties that we saw forming around Brexit in the UK, and then smaller groups that we've seen forming here, particularly in the aftermath of Repeal the 8th here. But we were concerned about that, and as a response, we formed a thing called, or launched a campaign called Unity Over Division, which ultimately was set in workplaces. Unite is a large trade union in the UK and has a large presence inside of big companies and big industries. So it could be effective in that response in terms of being able to go into the workplace and to discuss and launch an education program, initially around trying to defeat or trying to challenge the narrative of the far right, challenge that narrative around migrant labour, and challenge a lot of the myths. Now, ultimately, that's had to adapt and change over the years, and the way we do it in Ireland is a little bit different, in that we've reached sort of outside of our membership into communities to try and bring that education out. And it's obviously been quite difficult during the pandemic, and the way in which we organise and the way in which we do our work is strained by that. But however, it's really important that we continue to do it. It's very, very important for us that we're doing that work in a face-to-face way at a grassroots level, that we're present inside of communities, in workplaces, in the canteen, in the library, in the college, and so on, because a lot of the myth busting stuff doesn't necessarily work, because what you're dealing with, in my opinion, is emotions, and that's what the far right do very, very well. They go in and they capitalize on the emotions, the anger and the fears that people have. And the only way you can really win people back from that is to talk to them face to face, is to build that trust and solidarity with them. I don't believe that a lot of the tactics around myth busting have worked. I think they've actually entrenched people. So it is really, really important that we have a grassroots response. That's why we did Unity Over Division. We do a number of other things now, in terms of, like, we do a lot of work with football clubs, we do work with Sport Against Racism. We've got a thing called the Champions Cup in the Republic of Ireland, or in the Irish region, North and South, which promotes diversity and equality and community. And they're very important to just try and build from inside of communities and build that respect. I think it's important to note, and I won't keep you too long, but I think it's important to note the difference in terms of of Ireland compared to a lot of countries in Europe for the trade union movement, because our trade union legislation is very, very poor. We don't have the right to collective bargain as our colleagues in the UK and most of Europe do. And we don't have an automatic recognition from employers. And this is problematic because I think that as a trade union movement, what we should be using things like collective bargaining for is to have things like they do in a lot of places in the UK now. They have a charter. They can introduce this as part of their negotiation with an employer. It's not just about the wages and the conditions and the hours of working, but it's also about a respect charter. It's also about diversity and equality in the workplace. It's also about anti-racism rules and so on. That we don't have that position to negotiate as a trade union movement here. So I think collective bargaining is tied in, and that progressive trade union type of trade union is tied into the campaign against racism and for equality. Another campaign that we recently launched was around migrant labour. We might, if any of you have passed our office, we have a big banner on our office now, calling for basically the trade union to organise migrant labour, because this is another area where the far right take advantage. They come in and they fill a vacuum there as well, and migration is not going to stop. It's going to continue because of war and because of climate change. And the best way that we can have of cutting across that being used for racism and used for the far right is to organise all of those workers. And that means organising them on an equal level where people inside the workplace, no matter where they come from, have the same right to progress, to become a manager or whatever it is as anybody else. And that's currently not the case in Ireland. And it's not the case anywhere really for migrant workers. And this is one of the crucial things that the trade union movement needs to come to grips with across Europe, across the globe, is to have that across the board organisation, because ultimately anything that divides workers, any sort of, if we allow people to be categorised into different categories because they're migrant or because they're from a different country or because they're women, it just leaves a gap for them to be exploited. And exploitation is ultimately, I believe, what racism is really, really about. It's a tool for exploitation to keep people divided and so on. So I'll leave it at that. If you can ask more questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, Rona. That's fascinating work that you're doing, and I'd love to hear more about it in the panel discussion. We're now going to move on to Gavin. The floor is yours, Gavin.
Thank you, Pranav. And I'm just going to try to hopefully complement what Bryan and Rona said by talking a little bit about the far right in relation to media, which is what my research is on. But more important than anything to do with research, I really think, while I'm no expert on the far right movements and actors, I don't think we can understand contemporary far right movements, actors, or indeed politics, and beyond that, ideology and the circulation of far right ideas without thinking about the role different kinds of media play in this politics right now. And when I say that, I don't want to make it look as if it's all about the media, or that's the central or main factor we need to look at. But I think if you look at some other countries, if you look at the UK, for example, if you look at France, if you look at the United States, you have structural parts, big powerful institutions within the media systems that are amplification machines for far right ideas. In other words, far right ideas circulate in polite discourse, public discourse, mainstream politics, way beyond far right actors or their articulation by far right actors. So it's not just, I think, these days that we can't understand the far right without talking about media, but we can't understand media systems in many countries without thinking about the far right. It's not quite that situation in Ireland, but I think to understand the kinds of movements and groups and campaigns and fronts that we see here, we need to think a little bit about the different ways in which media facilitate them. So I just want to give some maybe ideas from research in relation to that, and we can, unpack them more in the discussion. I want to just start by sort of underlining something that Rona said there. I mean, I think one of the things that's very important to a discussion like this is to try to get to grips with the constantly shifting, changing nature of the far right as a political space, as a very, very complicated and heterogeneous political space. But when we do that, we can't lose track of the fact that there's historical continuity in what they do, which is that they target enemies of the nation, be they political enemies or racialized enemies or gendered enemies. They target them for harassment and up to and including elimination. And in the kinds of small groups and fronts and movements that we've seen in Ireland, as Rona said, they have gone after, they have targeted, they have racialized targets, particularly in their campaigns around direct provision. They've targeted Muslim prayer and religious spaces. They've targeted LGBT plus events, and they've targeted anti-choice and trade union activism. So there's a historical continuity there of boots on the street looking for particular targets, which we cannot sort of, allow to be brushed to the side by definitional debates or anything else like that. At the same time, I think when we look at the contemporary far right, it's often very confusing to look at the sheer map and range of diversity of ideas and kinds of movements that you get there, and how also they relate to the politics, the mainstream politics in every society in which we come to look at them. There's a quotation from work by John Solomos and Les Back, which I always turn to in these discussions, which is, they say that racism is a scavenger ideology, as they put it, which gains its power from its ability to pick out and utilize ideas and values from other sets of ideas and that are operationalized or are circulating in a certain context. Let me give you an example of what they mean by that. The far right is, to a large extent, can be understood, or far right politics can be understood as a scavenger politics or a scavenger logic that picks over the bones of what's existing in a political system and amplifies and exaggerates it. So if you look at something at the campaigns against direct provision and the harassment of people living in direct provision by far right movements, on the one hand, this is a classic scavenger logic in that they are piggybacking or they're scavenging from the state racism of the direct provision system. And at the same time, what they're doing, of course, is they're using the language. They're also picking from, scavenging from the language of human rights. They're saying we're doing this to protect the rights of people who shouldn't have to live here. They shouldn't come here in the first place, but they shouldn't have to live under these conditions. But at the same time, as this sort of scavenger logic, which allows them to sort of piggyback on what's going on in a political system or in a society at a given moment, there's also what Bryan emphasized, which is there's a constant emphasis on ideological production. So at the same time, in these direct provision campaigns, for example, you had the isolationist nationalism that Bryan was talking about, but you also had a turn to kind of great replacement theories, conspiracy theories about the nature of global migration, which are a product of these far right actors circulating in and learning and organizing in a transnational sort of media space. So on the one hand, here we get something which I think we really need to hold at the center of far right politics. Far right politics is riven with contradictions, it's riven with incoherence, and that's part of the power. It's not at all part of the weakness. So they could be isolationist nationalists on the one hand and learn from and be part of transnational media communities at the same time. And this is of strategic political value to them. There's no contradiction in it. And we've got to stop thinking that finding the contradictions in the logic, or as Rona said, thinking that by fact checking what it is that people are repeating as they come across these far right ideas, that our work is done. We don't live and exist in a seminar room. That's not how politics functions. So I just want to say a couple of things that I think might help us sort of situate the far right movements that we see in Ireland today. There's an awful cliche in studies or discussions of the far right in Ireland that we don't have far right political parties in the sort of Western European tradition, and therefore there's nothing really particularly to worry about. It's true that if we look at conventional political science and political movements in Europe, they tend to look at far right parties in various generations. There's a split in most countries in the decade after the Second World War, where some parties and movements decide to look for political legitimacy and therefore they moderate their message to a certain extent, whereas others double down and become much more extreme and much more underground, perhaps, as a result. And then the ideological horizon changes at various moments in the post-war period. According to two French sociologists, Camus and Leber, for example, the fourth wave, they argue, is what we're living in, which is a sort of post-September 11, 2001 clash of civilizations period. And I think this would be the period where we start to rethink, maybe we can discuss this later, the presence of far-right ideas in Irish politics and Irish political culture to a certain extent, because it's in the aftermath of 9/11 and the sort of within the contours of the clash of civilizations that it becomes much more acceptable in Ireland as elsewhere to start to circulate racialized ideas of a particular kind, and very centrally Brian mentioned Kevin Myers, or rather John Waters, we could mention Kevin Myers here as well, who were writing great replacement style op-eds right through the 2000s in the Irish Times, with barely an eyebrow raised about this. So if we were to start to situate some of the ideas that come back within far-right movements, we need to be aware of the fact that they circulate between, in some ways, the center or the radical center and the extremes in ways that we can map and ways that we can track. But it's impossible, I think, to conclude to understand the movements that exist today without thinking about the role, of course, of the internet and social media. One of the things that social media has done has given actors, the internet more generally, but it's a longer history, but let's take social media, is it's given the space and the possibility for people to become far-right actors in the absence of established movements and the kinds of structures, the mobilization structures that go with established movements that you do have, of course, in other European countries. And so one of the things we've seen over the last few years is a proliferation of movements that look like conventional political parties and have the kind of iconography and program that looks like a political party of the radical or extreme right. And at the same time, as part of the same milieu, you have groups whose identities are drawn from a real sort of vast array or a repertoire of possibilities that they have come across within a kind of transnational media space. The first real example of this, I suppose, in Ireland in some ways was the attempt a few years ago to organize a Pegida Ireland on the basis of the movement which began in Dresden in Germany in 2015, one of the big movements to respond to the borders crisis of 2015 and 16. And that was the beginnings of something that we can still see today, which is kind of mimetic movements that work in one place and through Facebook in particular, for example, seek to be organized in other places, often with very limited success and limited capacity to mobilize. But what we have seen since then, again, is further changes in the Irish scene, which map onto changes elsewhere. YouTube entrepreneurs, for example, single issue groups, AstroTurf issue groups, all of which are quite diverse when you look at the things that they might say that they're interested in. But at the same time, all of them coalesce around who they're targeting, which is, again, the racialized and other enemies of the state and enemies of a pure society. So when we find ourselves talking about the far right now in Ireland, we're obviously talking about it at some point in this endless pandemic, where we've seen the capacities of far right actors to integrate themselves into various forms of social discontent and dislocation around the consequences of the COVID pandemic and the actions of the state in relation to the COVID pandemic. And they've been able to do that for many reasons, but partly to do with the architecture of the internet and the architecture of social media. So I think we're at a crucial moment in understanding the ways in which forms of far-right action are facilitated by the deep integration of social networks into our everyday life, but also into our media systems as well, which is part of where I started with the fact that we can't just talk about far-right actors, but we have to talk about the proliferation and increased acceptability of far-right ideas in political cultures more generally. And hopefully I can specify some more of this to Ireland in the discussion after. Thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. That was fascinating, and I love how you tied in your ideas with everything that Brian and Rona said before you. We're going to move on to a panel discussion now. So I'd like to request all of our panelists to switch on your cameras. So we can all kind of see each other and just bounce across the room as we discuss certain things that you've raised. I'd also encourage the audience to write their questions into the Q&A form, and we'll come to them towards the end. My first question actually is for Brian, and you know I read a little bit of your book, Migration and the Making of Ireland, Brian. And what I liked about it is that you've added some sort of much needed specificity to the history of migration in Ireland. You've actually shown, contrary to the sort of the common sense view of Ireland, that Ireland is something of a melting pot of Western Europe. I was just wondering how much of this book and the turn to this history was actually motivated by contemporary political events, such as the rise of the far right in Ireland and in other places across the world?
Well, I've had an intellectual project for about 20 years that has been often about kind of, if you will, helping to put in place or initiate a literature that basically, if you will, repositions how we think about Ireland and Irishness in an era of mass migration and what would now be regarded as large-scale immigration. So that would basically, in initial stages, about recovering the experiences of racism of travelers and others, such as Jewish people in Ireland. But the Migration and the Making of Ireland book is kind of it was deliberately designed as a sort of an accessible history of Ireland since 1600, told through the lens of both immigration and emigration. So the way in which I approached the chapters was basically, I asked the same questions about immigrants as I would ask about immigrants. Who are they? Why do they migrate? What kind of experiences do they have? What kind of social interactions or relationships they have? Where do faith communities figure in this? You know, where does economics figure in this? Where does the law figure in this? So whether I was talking about people emigrating who were Quakers over to Pennsylvania in the 17th century, or whether I was talking about Pentecostal Christians setting up in Drogheda in the 21st century, I was essentially looking at these different groups through a similar kind of prism. So in a sense there, basically, I wanted to challenge basically the exceptionalism of the Irish story that often comes across. This kind of idea that we have a certain sort of, you can only tell things from the position of thinking in terms of Ireland and Irish stories and so on and so forth. And you get people introducing themselves gradually and then becoming more Irish over time. The idea that there is a history of Ireland, or that histories in Ireland more generally, should basically include references to minority groups, immigrants and emigrants, and consider basically the modernization and development of Ireland, social change more generally, through the lens of these population movements just makes sense. I mean, it's perhaps basically the way in which we need to think about history right now, but it's also a tool for thinking about the present. Now, that particular book was basically part of a kind of has its twin in Diverse Republic, which is more about, okay, so that's the story. Where are we now, and what perhaps should we do about it? Now, when I wrote that particular book, which is a shorter book, came out this year, it was not designed to be an overtly prescriptive book. It ends up with a series of questions more so than anything else. But I do believe we live in a diverse republic, that we can claim for something very positive and something very inclusive in the way that Rhoda talked about through various acts of solidarity. We need to engage with certain ideas that are out there and offer rivals to or contest basically the kinds of ideas that are, as Gavin put it, the kind of things that the scavenger right play on. So in other words, if basically there is an idea of us as a nation or a republic, let's not leave that to the right to populate what that means. Let's think more positively and more inclusively about that. And again, it's not a project that any one person can do. My version of the Irish Republic is not any special. I'm just one citizen out of many. But I do think that basically we have within our grasp the possibility of basically having an inclusive Ireland and thinking about ourselves broadly defined in an inclusive way and doing positive things with that in relation to politics that can contest many of the ideas and tropes that Gavin talks about that seem remorseless in the extent to which they can crop up all over the place. But we nevertheless need to remind ourselves that there's actually much that is fairly decent, fairly okay, that if we're not in the mood for celebrating it absolutely, at least we should acknowledge that it's not totally appalling or terrible. So for example, the fact that basically we don't have a large-scale right-wing populist nationalist party in Ireland, that for various historic reasons, Irish people are broadly speaking comfortable with immigration and social change, that many people hold a very positive view of the country, such as the Ipsos survey that came out recently, and we had an economic crisis that was terrible and cruel in ever so many ways, but we don't blame it on immigrants. That basically, if we had something like a Brexit, we had it nearly 100 years ago, in the sense that we allowed basically nativism and isolationism to drive out all other considerations. And to let isolationism shape the future of our country, that Irish people perhaps think rather differently than that. At the same time, never to let go of the fact that racism exists in our society, and we're very blasé about it often, and we don't know near enough about it, and that basically we have a very light touch perhaps on many areas where we need a much more robust approach to social policy and other things that we need to do to ensure that we have an inclusive Ireland. So we've a lot basically to there's a lot of positives there, I think, that need to be emphasized in the Irish case. And if you're unwilling to emphasize the positives, you're kind of basically, I think, feeding the scavenger, as Gavin put it, I think. So it's a very, very delicate balance. That doesn't mean you need to big up Ireland PLC in all its shapes or forms, that you can't be desperately unhappy with aspects of it. But at the same time, there are many things where we can sort of breathe out slightly and say, my God, that's not as terrible as it could be. Or maybe there's a lot that's very, very positive to build on. The fact that we don't have mainstream political parties jostling for all of the ideas that are terrible, that drive the nativist right in other Anglophone democratic countries, is a positive thing. Now, that's not to say that we should be very, very careful that not to say that like all sorts of things do get an easy pass. So, for example, the treatment of asylum seekers and other groups. So there are things that we do that are incredibly cynical. Our politics does speak with two sides of its face at times. We are maybe benign towards migrants, but we're neglectful of so many things. So yeah, there's an awful lot of work to be done. But if all we can say, this is crisis, 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 then we give it over to people who say, well, we have very, very simple answers to very complicated problems. And I don't think we can do that. So it's quite a nuanced thing. I think there are positive examples to pull from Ireland. I look at people like Michael D. Higgins, who is very good at speaking to different constituencies and talking about Ireland in an inclusive way, whilst never letting go himself of the idea that there's much wrong with this country. And I think that's an example of how some people in politics can do that. At the same time, there are groups that never let go of the fact that there are certain groups that are really, really marginalized and fight hard for that. And that's very, very important as well. So there's a thing in politics called the Overton window. It's basically that which is acceptable or deemed acceptable to have in mainstream conversation. What can you actually say on radio? What can you say in the national papers? Well, you can get away with saying an awful lot less in the Irish case, perhaps, than you get away with saying in the British case. And notwithstanding outliers like Kevin Myers and John Waters and others, and these common sense nativists or whatever, people, when they cross the line, like Kevin Myers did with a reference to Jewish people, or John Waters at various stages, they get basically kicked out of the tent. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's broadly speaking a good thing, but it basically means that people, when they speak about these issues, their inclination is perhaps to say too little than to say enough, as in basically everybody will say the pieties about how terrible direct provision is, blah, 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 but nobody's willing to do much about anything, perhaps at times. At the same time, you don't have the equivalent of Nigel Farage and others basically bombarding the centre. You don't see every conversation on radio for balance having some absolute right-winger for balance against somebody who's moderately progressive. So basically there are some positive things here. And it is quite nerve-wracking watching this, as I have been for 20 years, worrying about it and how it's going to turn out in play. But I'd have to say that in many respects I've been pleasantly surprised. And I just like to put that idea out there.
Yeah, no, there's a lot there. And actually I think one of the themes that I think we all really want to talk about is the idea of the scavenger and this idea that there are some failures of liberal democracy, of the social democratic project that make it easier for the far right to flourish. And I just want to home in on that and get Rona to talk more about this, because in anthropology, for example, Appadurai has written about how the anxieties of globalization, about how living in this globalized world where nation states don't actually have that much of a control over the national economy has actually shifted national politics towards the politics of cultural sovereignty. So, for example, we can't control who might have a job tomorrow, but we can control who gets to participate in our national economy. And that is why a lot of the nationalist rhetoric of the far right is the rhetoric of economic nationalism. But my question here for you, Rona, is how do we fight this? How do we fight this very pervasive democracy fatigue? Because as someone on the ground, as someone who's engaged every day in grassroots activism, is there a sense of a model of how we can actually channel this fatigue maybe in a better way, or how we could actually mitigate it in some way?
Well, to be honest, I think if we kind of relied on models, we'd be making a mistake, because none of us have a crystal ball, and things develop and dynamics change all the time. I think an interesting thing maybe to look back at over the last 10 years was the campaign in Ireland against the water charges, which was a very much a class-based campaign. And I think sometimes we forget to talk about class when we're talking about racism. And it's important to remember that it was the working class communities in Britain that the far right targeted originally when it went through austerity and Brexit. And that's the same here as well. Like, you know, they did make attempts and inroads during, or tried to make inroads during that campaign of water charges, and they failed miserably. And the reason why was because there was such a huge mobilization and sense of social solidarity around that campaign, particularly in working class communities, where you had people organizing on a daily basis, whether that was organizing to prevent lorries coming in or to organize protests. People had set up WhatsApp groups, and these are communities, you know, organizing themselves. And that sense of, I suppose, social solidarity cut across any of that. And it was during that time, actually, that famous, when Pedega tried to organize in O'Connell Street, it was actually in the middle of that, when they were chased off the street, and they were chased off the street by a lot of the water protesters. And it's still a lot of them who are still online, who are kind of saying, look, you know, we can't tolerate this. And for the first time in a lot of communities, people were meeting their neighbors who they never met before from different backgrounds. So that kind of mobilization was able to cut across a lot of that, but you can't guarantee any of these things that will happen, or that the dynamics will happen in the same way again in the future. I think from our perspective, it is a matter of being able to talk to people and to try and keep communicating with people. And one of the things that the trade union movement has that the far right don't have is that personal reach. You know, I mean, I know obviously, and Gavin has mentioned how much they take advantage of social media. And in a way, we kind of fight a losing battle on that, because it's very easy to tell a lie. You go out and tell a lie, and once we start to explain and find that truth, we're losing really. Like, so it's the actual human contact and the reach that we have with people through our organizations. It is key, I think, and it's an advantage that nobody else really has, and we have to really keep using that, and we have to take that very seriously. I think as well, like, I mean, there can be some complacency around the far right, and in that they may not have a political party the way they have in other European countries, but they can still do a lot of damage without that. You know, I know the results in the most recent by-election in Dublin Bay South was very, very low for the far right. It was tiny. However, you know, during the 80s in the UK, there was very small groups as well, and they managed to burn people's shops and murder people, and, you know, they're still very, very dangerous. So I think we have to kind of be careful how we're measuring them, that we're not just measuring them through electoral success, because they're capable of a lot of damage besides that, you know. But in terms of sort of how we organize, I think we just have to keep doing what we do. But I think we also need to take note that society is changing, technology is changing, media is changing, and we need to kind of update, I think, a bit. I think in the trade union movement, we're far behind in that sense, that we don't utilize in the same way all that technology and all that modern media the way the far right have done through YouTube and so on. And that's, I don't think we're going to catch up, but I think we need to start thinking a little bit less traditionally than we have done for the last 100 years, and form new methods, and think about trade unionism as well in a different way, because the nature of work, jobs, that sort of full-time employment for your whole career in the one place, it doesn't exist anymore, with precarity and so on, that we need to think differently about how we organize and how we build for people outside of that traditional workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Gavin, could I get you to comment on this as well? Because I think one of the strengths of this panel is that we have activists and academics together, and you know, it is in that sense a great platform to sort of counter-strategize this stuff. So how do you see the path forward for counter-strategizing against the far right in Ireland?
It's a big question, and it's you know, it's not really for me to say in some ways, because I think, you know, while we do have a panel with activists and academics, there's nothing worse than academics telling activists, you know, what they should be doing. But I think there's a couple of things you can comment on. I mean, I might start with Rona's point there, which I think is an interesting one about, you know, if we do, because I would, I think we can put a couple of the pictures here together. I mean, I think Bryan is absolutely right to emphasize the kind of marginal nature of far right politics in terms of actors, movements, and parties, and what that means for certain kinds of resilience and orientation in the political system. And therefore, where far right ideas circulate beyond these within Irish mainstream political and media culture, it's either because they're taken up by macho communists, or because TDs looking for an edge in a particular constituency will do that sort of, I wouldn't go that far, but I hear what you're saying and I'll voice the ordinary concerns. We know those kinds of moves. So those kind of amplification or alliances are fairly scripted. And again, this is where Rona's point is important, that they're marginal doesn't mean they don't do damage. They can really do a lot of damage to people's lives, to people's livelihoods, and to their safety, and to their sense of being in any way included in the kind of vernacular or some kind of easy multiculturalism Bryan was talking about, which I think we can also talk about experiencing in this country. So I mean, I think when it comes to counter-strategizing, then we've got to take seriously this sort of marginality without amplifying it into something which it isn't, and without at the same time assuming that marginality doesn't mean effect or consequence or significance, and that marginality doesn't have the capacity under different sorts of circumstances to grow in particular kinds of ways. And I think that that's where COVID has been interesting, because the forms of growth which are possible for the kinds of movements and networks we see right now are opportunistic. They are very much sort of scavenger-like in the way that Bach and Solomons talk about it, in that they can, link themselves to the kinds of alienation and anger and upset and dislocation which existed during COVID, and also the strange sort of social atmosphere of the period. And they can easily, one thing that the internet does, of course, is that it launders information. It's impossible to pull it back to particular ideological sources. So people are engaging with, I mean, I must say, I don't have much time for notions of filter chambers and echo bubbles and all of that nonsense, but we can talk about that another time. But one of the things that does happen to people is that they're engaging with forms of information where the provenance of that information isn't particularly clear. And in fact, some of the studies that have come out about COVID are kind of interesting, to have a small digression, which is about people sharing misinformation. A lot of people shared misinformation because they were worried and caring about others. So the classic thing was people sharing it on a family WhatsApp because, they'd read this thing somewhere and it might be of use to somebody. So yes, there's lots of misinformation, but it doesn't mean there's a desire to misinform and all of that kind of thing. But it's clear during COVID, you have a kind of a media and information situation and a social situation, which provided a certain kind of opportunistic framework for the far right, such as it exists in Ireland. And I think that it's under those kinds of conditions where there's a chance of something spectacular, there's a chance of something disruptive, there's a chance to target particular spaces or communities or symbols, that's where we're going to see more of that kind of action. And it is increasingly, as we saw with attacks on journalists and activists during this period, the sense of violence on the streets, which is not that pronounced, but it's present in these movements as well. Just on counter-strategizing, I think that I just want to pick up on one point that both Bryan and Rona have mentioned in different ways. I think it's important that we think about the role of media in this, but again, without putting media, that's what media scholars always say, we can't put media at the heart of everything, and then you talk about it all the time. But what I want to say is that we can't, I don't think we need to think about what is it that we can do that somehow cancels out or matches what the far right does with social media. And the reason I say is not that I think media strategies aren't important, but for progressive movements, for civil society and the left, movement media is about building ideas together, and those ideas become in some ways part of the not just the shared information, but the feeling in common that allows a sort of a movement or a group or a community to mobilize. It's exactly the opposite when it comes to the far right, because there's no need for shared understanding, because there's this stronger sort of affective politics that Rona was talking about, because it is very, very easy for groups that are targeting different populations, come from different political traditions on the far right, to work with each other tangentially or contingently for a period of time. There's no pressure on them to develop ideas and understandings collectively in the same way. So they thrive through disruption, they thrive through noise. And the problem for us is that noise gets in the way of those common understandings, but also digital noise is a labor relation. As Rona said, if you take the borders crisis of 2015-16, it takes a couple of minutes to create these infographics which show that, X amount of sexual assaults have taken place in this city in Germany, and circulate it. And therefore it's out there, and people are, as was happening, people are protesting, small riots were starting. It takes the public authorities days and weeks of work to respond to that 1-2 minute infographic, and even then they're correcting the facts that can't be corrected, because this isn't, it isn't a debate in society. So I think what we need to think of instead is, what are the forms of media that use the same kinds of platforms that can consolidate the kind of, not replace, but consolidate the kind of face-to-face conversations that Rona was talking about, and that can then in other ways, because I think, generation has a lot to do with this here, can in other ways think about how to reach, for example, young people through the kinds of platforms where one of the things that absolutely is happening at the moment is this laundering of far-right ideas in all kinds of ways, as they get sort of combined into and move through different sorts of flows. So I think, for me, a strategy involves a number of things. It involves countering the specific movements and standing in solidarity with the people that they target, and doing that physically, materially, politically, publicly, symbolically. It also then involves thinking about what are the ways in which we can best counter far-right ideas without being sucked onto the terrain they would prefer us to play on, which I think is very, very difficult indeed.
Rona, would you like to respond to that or add to that?
Yeah, look, I agree with that, and that is kind of part of the thing, is that we have been dragged onto their platforms quite a bit, and even with the myth busting as well, it's somewhere where we haven't been successful, and I think we have to recognise where we haven't been successful, and go back and look at things again. But I do think, in terms of how we use media as well, that we are lagging behind a good bit. And that we haven't, certainly in the Irish trade union movement, and I'm only speaking from an Irish perspective, that we haven't invested in that, in terms of taking that really serious as a media outlet, as a media platform. I actually don't think that, I think that if we were to try and do that now, it wouldn't work for us anyway. We're kind of too late. So we have to think a little bit outside the box in that sense, and get a bit more creative. But again, it's a reflection of union density as well, and probably the age group as well, and the generational thing as well, of people who had previously come from that kind of working class tradition, and it's not there in the younger generation, and there's a whole gap there in terms of technology and social media that we haven't been on the ball. Having said that, I wouldn't emphasize how much success they've had on these things either. Because social media, as I'm sure you're all aware, it exists in bubbles as well, and for a lot of the time you're talking to the same people, and we know that ourselves, that they can be sort of in a loop of the same people with the same stuff going around. And we know that the far right in Ireland, there's huge crossover between the different groups, so it's not like they might be 12 or 20 organizations, but most of those people have been in the same organizations back and forth. So the number isn't as big, it's amplified by social media, but it isn't that big. And as well, a lot of the stuff, thankfully up till now, has been so strange, if you like, that some of the stuff that they've put out there online has been so, some of the things that Gemma O'Doherty has done, and so they've been so they look a bit crazy to a lot of people, and because of that, they undermine their own credibility. But having said that, you've got to, I think that people like Gemma O'Doherty play a specific role in that they're going out to do the craziest thing to see how far they can push things. And it's the people who are watching behind her learn from that and adapt. And they know how far they can push things then. And they've used those things quite cleverly. And I think without getting into any specifics, I think we need to have a strategy around how we measure their behavior, if you like, or their patterns on social media.
Yeah, and that is that idea of the Overton window as well, of certain of the mainstreaming of radical discourse by the sheer force of its repetition, of sort of making these ideas seem normal by just repeating them and echoing them, and that goes back to what Bryan said in his opening statement as well. So Bryan, would you like to come in here and say something more about this?
Yeah, I mean, a number of points come to mind. First of all, over the years, I've been following a lot of far-right people online, on social media and so on Twitter. And I'm often amazed how much of what they have to say falls on deaf ears. I mean, it's like a lot of things on social media, it's this ongoing clamor for attention. Like me, share me. But often it's not that liked, it's not that shared. And if it is, basically it's shared by bots that are in the control of similar people and so on and so forth. So things that happen on Twitter aren't real, I mean, in some extent. So we need to bear that in mind. Two other points I'd like to make at this stage. One is basically, we haven't really spoken about who we mean by the far right. Gavin put in an academic definition earlier, distinguishing between, say, the extreme right and the radical right. In other words, basically where they are vis-a-vis democracy and so on and so forth. One kind associates would accept democracy up to the point, as long as minorities aren't involved and outsiders. But the point of it is that I think the wager of the far right, if I put it that way, when I look at basically what people have been trying to achieve on the far right, and I mean the convention, I mean those kind of small political parties and actors to some extent, like people have been named so far, is that what they've been trying to do is basically gain support on the basis that they see there's an audience out there that others aren't listening to. So when we think of, so a number of different groups can be put together as potential supporters of the far right. And one of them that was mentioned at the beginning of this presentation were people who are anti-choice. So there's 30% of people in the Republic who are anti-choice. Now, that doesn't mean they're all going to be, Trumpians. It may mean they have an ethical position on abortion, but maybe very, very different attitudes and a whole bunch of other things. But if you have a political system that tells them they have no other home other than the far right, where does that bring you to over time? So there is a sort of you shouldn't be leaving large swathes of the population whose opinions don't necessarily agree with your ones to the mercies of the far right, and telling them that, don't monster them. That would be one thing. Another point, which I don't think it's a significant problem in Ireland, but I think it's something that worries me when I see examples of it from time to time. And I think of the Pediga March in particular, the demonstration, which I went to. And my memory of that day falls into two portions. One was this wonderful expression of solidarity between people who were often being interviewed by media, whether they were Muslims, whether they were basically migrant organizations, all manner of things, and this wonderful banners and all the rest of it. And then basically a very small bunch of thugs chased another small bunch of thugs through some shops. And the idea that we're somehow making heroes of people who are engaged in sort of counter violence against people who really who themselves make, that doesn't make an awful lot of sense to me. I don't agree with it to begin at a personal level, but I do see it as playing into the hands absolutely of the other. So when I went home and watched the news that night, I saw basically the small group of far right people who were there being chased through shops, and that didn't look good. And in no way would I countenance that kind of violence towards people. My understanding of it was a very, very tiny number of basically far right people attended, and they were a drop in the ocean compared to the bunch of people who had a very, very different vision as to what our society was. So that's not a very big issue, but I do think that when we're addressing these groups, and yes, they're inchoate, yes, they're all over the place, yes, they believe in different things, yes, basically it's post-fact, but we may not be able to counter their message basically by checking their facts, but we can be disciplined in terms of what we mean and hold to our own good values, which are about, I mean, we would agree in a lot of things and perhaps disagree in some others, but presumably we agree basically, in tolerance, accepting different viewpoints up to, and the right to disagree with them, hoping to keep the conversation at all times civilized, and to be able to position to critique and challenge directly ideas that we disagree with. So, I mean, those are the sorts of comments that come to mind at this stage. I don't think there's any big meta answer. I do think that basically that some people are being dragged into all manner of things, going on crazy journeys they themselves don't quite understand. I know some people who are very pro the rights of asylum seekers. Personally know some people, but who also admired Dolores Cahill tremendously as well. And in their own idea, that the intersection of these ideas was very, very strange for them. Now, they probably wouldn't accept it, being told they're on the far right, but if that's all they're ever going to hear, then eventually they are on the far right. So we sort of basically have to, I guess, play it a bit carefully, really, in terms of how we label others as well within this. So it's quite complicated. There's no doubt about that. It's quite complicated. I don't have any easy answers. I'm only an academic. and it is not my job to tell people what to do. All it is basically to try and understand what's going on. And even there, I'll say I don't understand what's going on beyond a certain point. Okay.
I think that's a really important, there's a really important point there about the people who didn't vote for repeal. And I think it's something that we all need to be very, very careful about. And who are the far right, and what are we talking about? And we need to kind of sometimes separate our anti-racism work from our monitoring of the far right, if you like, because there are differences. And we have to be very careful around that 30% or whatever. If you think, for example, there are many migrants in this country who come from religious backgrounds who wouldn't agree with us or agree with me in terms of the repeal of the 8th Amendment. But that doesn't mean that they would support any sort of racist activity. In fact, some of them might be victims of racism in this country themselves. So I think we really, really have to be very careful, because what we need to be doing is building coalitions of people on the ground in our communities. So we shouldn't be going into these things in a position of that I agree with this, this, and this, and if you don't, you can't be in this coalition with me. So you have to be really cognizant, I think, of that. And that means having a kind of a definition. Now you can go through all the parties and you can, and all the little groups, and say, decide where you want to put them on the spectrum. But I think ultimately we need to kind of be aware that what we're talking about, when we're talking about organizations that resort to violence to basically smash working class people, to divide working class people, who are prepared to injure people based on their religion or their background or so on. This is what they are. They play a historic role in that sense of attacking people and being incredibly divisive. And I do find like some of the and we haven't mentioned it so far in this discussion, but there's a huge amount of anti-traveller racism in Ireland, which is not recognised by a lot of people, and unfortunately is tolerated by far too many, and there isn't enough people prepared to do something about that. Now, I recently witnessed some, and I'm sure people have similar examples. I witnessed a discussion online around, I think it was around one of the reports that came out about Spring Lane in Cork, about the conditions of the travelling community. And there were some really nasty comments, kind of, in the backlash there, they're only looking for more money and this kind of thing, And I looked at some of the people who were making these points, and some of them had things like Black Lives Matter on their profiles, So it was okay. They were kind of, maybe it's trendy or something to have Black Lives Matter. Maybe it looks good for your friends or something. But then you make these comments which were just as racist, So there's a lot of stuff going on there in Ireland around these things like that. We don't necessarily separate them and kind of really think, what are we talking about here? And I think, the stuff like direct provision and anti-traveller stuff is stuff that's very, very worrying. I think that there's so much complacency around it, that there isn't an outcry. I mean, if anybody has ever visited, and I've been in a number of places where travelling people live in Ireland. In recent months, in 2021, in the middle of a pandemic, with no water and no electricity and no sanitation, and it's you think you're dreaming when you're looking at it. You say, this can't be right, but this is right, and this is tolerated in Ireland. So there's a lot in what we're talking about around racism in this country. But I think the point that Bryan made about being very, very careful about who we're pushing out, I think is very important.
Gavin, I think you wanted to come in there as well, and then we move on to the Q&A because we have a few questions coming in. So just a quick comment as well.
I mean, just on that, I mean, it's just actually a very empirical reaction to it. I mean, I agree, right? Just if we take seriously the what this moment is producing is politics that are in all of these ways sort of incoherent, right? We can't make sense of them by saying, here is a far right ideology and here are far right actors. And definitely it makes absolutely zero sense outside of people who have committed themselves either as foot soldiers or media entrepreneurs to mobilize far right sentiment and action. It makes very little sense to alienate people by saying, you're just a fascist, you're just on the far right, or whatever it might be. That doesn't mean that they can't be held responsible for articulating far right ideas and explaining where they come from. But the empirical point I want to make is this: we often discuss this notion that we can't, shouldn't alienate people by calling them far right. Actually, the problem in Ireland is we don't talk about the far right at all outside of these kinds of meetings and outside of a handful of committed groups. A really brilliant researcher student of mine, Cian Cowman, did a study of the media coverage of all of the anti-lockdown protests during the 2020-21 period, and looked at the reporting of the protests, who organized them, who spoke, what they said, and there was almost no mention of the far right. And the only sustained mention of it was when the Garda commissioner came out and said that this is the fault of the far right and the far left. So there was actually no public discourse about the role of the far right and the presence of far right politics, any meaningful public political discourse around those protests. So I think, we need to think it from the other side as well, that we have far right politics is really complex in form and ideology and shape and formation right now. And what won't help us is a very narrow definition and then saying everything else is something else. But neither does it help us, to just say everybody who's responding in these ways is that sort of political other over there and can't be engaged with. But what lies between those is the kind of work we need to be doing now.
Yeah, and actually on that point about adding some more specificity to how we talk about the far right, there's actually a great question from a colleague in Maynooth, Rebecca King-O'Rain, and she's written that, and she's asking the panel that, given that the panel topic is about race and racism, can you talk about the notions and articulations of race that the far right in Ireland hold beyond biological essentialism? So that's open to anyone who wants to take that question.
It's not always about race in that sense. I mean, it's about race in the broader term or understanding of race as nation. And before Max Weber coined the term ethnicity, people use race, the Irish race, the German race, etc. But the idea of replacement theory is one of those ideas that's getting an awful lot of coverage. Gavin mentioned it earlier, that some of the, one particular economist started writing in those directions. So this idea that we're going to be replaced by immigrants and their children is something that's articulated. But I would say that perhaps the continuum is one between ethnicity, between economy and culture. And by all accounts, as far as I can make out, looking at the far right groups I've looked at, which means not everybody, not all of them, but it's a preoccupation with culture. And within the culture, of course, their treatment and discussion of culture is always racialized. It's always racialized, as in basically there is that other basically is the bearer of certain characteristics. It is not us, it's a them, and so on. It is dangerous, and so on and so forth. So I would sort of say basically what we're seeing quite a lot of mobilization of our culture arguments. Now, the thing of it is that those culture arguments haven't had an awful lot of traction yet. And it's quite interesting. You mentioned the water protests and everything else, is that, an awful lot of people's grievances about the sort of economic situation. Basically people look to the left for solutions and ideas there. As I said earlier, they don't blame the economic crisis on migrants. And that is something to be very grateful for, because certainly it isn't migrants' fault. So in that context, basically, along with other so-called culture wars, what you're seeing basically are people reaching for the much more fluid arguments about culture in all its manifestations. I think, and some of those arguments are being racialized. And I would sort of say basically that's where we continue to go, certainly.
And actually, there's another question, and this one's from Sean Phelan, and this kind of skirts around what you've said as well. And Sean writes, "Great panel. The heterogeneity of the far right is often rendered ideologically coherent through the identification of shared enemies. We see this today in how so-called anti-wokeness," and he's put that in quotes, "has become a potent nodal point for different reactionary formations. Can the panel talk about the place of this cultural politics in an Irish context? Thanks." That's open to anyone who wants to take it. Gavin, do you want to take that?
Hi, Sean. Yeah, that's a really complicated question. I think it's an interesting one, because I'm not sure that anti-woke politics has much purchase in Irish cultural politics right now, and I'm not sure the ways in which it could be operationalized into something else. I mean, if we look at the sort of, I think it's an interesting question to ask, because on the one level, the sort of the wave of anti-wokeness is absurd. in its intensity and pitch of sort of reactionary hysteria. And yet it's incredibly important as a political force, you know, in the Republican response, say, to the Biden presidency. It's become an absolutely absurd presence in the early sort of period of the French presidential election debates, as various sort of centre candidates who've all migrated quite far to the right look for some kind of, to be able to put sort of light between each other. And obviously, you know, it's something which has been very central to Boris Johnson's kind of Tory party governance. So I mean, I think there's three things there that are maybe important about anti-wokeness, and the reason it doesn't apply perhaps in the same way in Ireland. The first is that there's, like in all of these, as you know well, Sean, there are continuities, which are almost like sort of kind of the grammar of reactionary argument. You know, there's a kind of sense in which anti-wokeness is a neo-Powellism, right? In other words, my constituency member had to tell me this because he can't say it out because he'd just be called a racialist. So there's that sort of structure of argument, which is that the ordinary people cannot say what they want to say. The ordinary people cannot do ordinary things and think ordinary things anymore without being called this, because those who were previously, you know, the subaltern are now in power, and they're in power because the elite, of course, is facilitating them. So, you know, it's something that articulates the sort of victimhood at the center of nationalism in ways that can always be updated according to the coordinates, the popular cultural or other coordinates. So there's an autonomy to it, which I think is important to emphasize before moving to my second point, which is that it's also a very strategized response to Black Lives Matter, to, in France, for example, decolonial and independent anti-racist movements, to Me Too, in particular as well, to trans visibility, and organizing. All of these feed into the sort of contemporary way in which anti-wokeness is set up to say, all of these people have taken too much, they're getting too much, they've had too much attention, they're imposing these things on us. But that only works because I think of the politics we talked about. Macron, Johnson are ruling the void. They're just looking for the next spectacle to fill time. And whether that's having, you know, your education minister talking about the imposition of critical race theory in British schools, despite the fact that this is an absolute fiction, or talking about as in France after the murder of the teacher Samuel Paty, where they had a very high-level debate about the need to curb academic freedom. So sort of imported wokeness wouldn't be taught there, which would feed the enemies of the Republic to sort of relativism and leftist argument and so on. So you've got that political context, and then you've got absolutely, and I see this in Aoife's question as well, you've got the partisan media system, which is one which is even more fragmented and desperately in competition for attention. And therefore anti-wokeness just becomes everyday content, where you can always find something on Twitter, you can always find some school principal to pick on, or you can always find some academic to pick on, or whatever it might be. We don't have those three sort of dimensions. So there's definitely a kind of, yeah, you know, the usual suspects, you know, kind of middle-aged male columnists and others that are, you know, desperate just to sort of smoke out wokeness in the name of the Irish people. But I'm not sure that the same kinds of points of reference are there. But I think there's an important political point to it as well, which is that political identities in Ireland have, over the last while, become very savvy at appropriating political progressiveness, and then saying, having appropriated this, having displayed our rainbow flag, having told you that we're against direct provision, now we're going to do nothing again. We're going to disguise our material neglect and our absolute lack of political interest in these issues or in the lives of these people by telling you that we're going to wear these badges. And so there's a kind of, I'm not sure how we, you know, sort of phrase that as a politics, which does something opposite. It kind of, you know, takes wokeness with all the problems with that as a way of saying, now leave us alone.
We are sort of using wokeness or symbols of wokeness as symbolic capital, perhaps.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's a question for Rona now, and this one's from Barry. Barry writes, often working class people are popularly associated with the far right. To what extent is this stereotype true, and how can it be countered?
Well, it's true, depending on the person. Like, you know, if they've gone into right-wing politics, then it's true. Like, but obviously, it's an area that people target, and you know, we've seen it here, we've seen it in Britain more particularly. And obviously we've seen it historically in Germany in the 1930s and so on. Sorry, what was I can't see that question there. Is it?
Yeah, he actually sent it to me as a direct
yeah.
message because he couldn't get the Q&A form to work. But it's basically that often working class people are popularly associated with the far right. So to what extent is this stereotype true, and how can it be countered?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's true for a start. You know, I think that it's an area that people target first of all, like, you know, because that's where the anger is, and it's about exploiting anger, really, and exploiting emotion. If you take, for example, the UK, you know, I mean, Tony Blair's Labour Party pretty much neglected a lot of working class communities in Britain. And as a result, the Labour Party were wiped out electorally. But these are also, in some cases, not in all, but in some cases, these are the areas that were targeted by the Brexit parties, the Nigel Farages and so on, to capitalise on that anger and that loss of services, for example, during austerity, you know, and to win and sort of capitalise on that, because the British Labour Party or social democracy wasn't providing that fight back at that time. So that's what happened there. I don't think it's happened to the same extent here. I think I know in my own community there's a right-wing candidate from the National Party who has made attempts to make inroads into our community, turning up at, you know, things that we would normally turn up at ourselves, and community initiatives and so on, tidy towns, all of that kind of thing, trying to make the usual inroads, and it hasn't worked. You know, the percentage of the vote is 1%, you know, so it hasn't really worked in that sense. But as I said earlier, that doesn't mean that they won't keep trying, campaigning for a seat, maybe a council seat. Once they get one sort of leg on the ladder, they will see that as a victory, and to use that as a platform then. And the danger is that if you get people like this elected into council positions, for example, you get a normalization of that language that they use that we were talking about earlier. And we certainly don't want that. And we'll do everything we can to make sure that they don't get those seats. I think that's very, very important, actually. But if I can just go back a little bit to the thing about race, because I have a friend who works for the FAI in terms of cultural integration of football and kids, basically grassroots. And he came here from England, and he comes from a generation that came from, his parents came from the Windrush generation. And he always says to me that it's funny that he doesn't believe there's such thing as race, but there's such thing as racism. And that stands out to me, that there is one race, the human race, but yet we have this thing called racism that divides people. So I think it's very much a human creation in that sense, that it's used specifically to divide people. And I think, you know, I think Bryan was saying about, you know, that we don't have a situation here where we're blaming migrants on this, that, and the other. But I think there's a potential for that, though, unfortunately. I think historically we have blamed the British, and that's you know, it's British imperialism, 800 years, and all of this was where we placed our blame and our anger. But I think we've seen in the last number of years, particularly around the housing issue, a little bit of that blame game starting to poke its head up. Particular demonstrations, I think, in Blanchardstown are correct, where it was house the Irish first. So you see a little bit of this going on, and it is an attempt to mirror something that has happened in the UK. So I think we should be kind of aware of that, and that it certainly can happen. But again, it's a similar thing. You know, it's what I said earlier. It's easy to tell a lie. It's harder to kind of then go back and explain the truth. You know, there's nothing in our housing policies in any council that favours anybody from a different migrant background or different cultural background. There's a waiting list, and it's the same for everybody. But we have to go and explain that. Once they go out and say it, people just, you know, they believe, you say it enough and people believe it, and they think, and it acts on emotion again. If it's your child, your son or daughter waiting for a house, or who are facing, you know, eviction, they take that emotion and that anger, and that's what they play on. And housing is an emotive issue. And that they picked it for a reason, you know.
Yeah, true. And just about that point about the far right in Ireland, that actually takes us really nicely to our next question, which is something I've often wondered as an immigrant in Ireland, which is, why do you think Ireland is an outlier in terms of the popularity of the far right compared to many other countries? And this is Aoife writing, and she writes that that she thinks that it's a mix of things, you know, the conservative hold over the church, the fallout in terms of child abuse allegations, the close memory of nationalist violence from the Troubles, and the absence of the very partisan media. But she wants to know all of your thoughts on why Ireland doesn't seem to have a well-established far right.
I'll have a go.
Absolutely. Bryan, you muted yourself. We can't hear you.
Mute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go on.
Lovely.
Have another go.
There are a number of things that strike me as perhaps a little bit distinct about Ireland. The first of it is that in European and Anglophone countries, generally speaking, mainstream politics can use nationalism in the way that Boris Johnson and others do it to big up the nation in a certain kind of way. I think due to the Northern Ireland conflict since the 1950s, I think Irish politicians across the mainstream, including Sinn Féin, have become very nuanced about how they basically raise the national question and national identity and mobilize this. And I think there's a real sophistication around thinking about this and sense of responsibility, generally speaking, in that area, in that space. And I think it's because, unlike the British, unlike perhaps the Dutch and others, you know, we have witnessed in our country basically how that kind of the unleashing, if you will, those kinds of emotions can result of thousands of people dying in our living memory. And I think to some extent that is part of it, that we've quite a sophisticated take on what we should be saying and doing, how we should be playing the game of nationalism. So the far right stuff just seems very, very off color altogether. So I think that's certainly part of it. Second of all is that Ireland, you know, has been engaged very aggressively in a sense in globalization, transnational economic nation building, working and developing the nation, modernizing on a very globalized model, very consciously since around the time of Sean Lemass, after half a century of cultural isolationism. So I think that kind of developmentalism is kind of as a national rhetoric. I know maybe various people here might have a lot of problems with that in the sense of always bigging up Ireland PLC. If it's good for the economy, it must be good for the country. There is a sort of an ideological thing there going on. And thirdly, I think that the multi-seat constituency model of proportional representation make it very difficult for right-wing parties to get traction. And it's, as Gavin put it earlier, that the person most likely to do well out of is somebody who raises a few issues about direct provision or travellers or others and kind of hoovers up a certain amount of vote by making sort of certain statements or appeals that most politicians wouldn't do, that basically would be outside the Overton window, generally speaking, that basically most politicians would find themselves censured by their own political parties for so doing. So I think that there's several local things going on here. I think it's those things that perhaps have shaded it into perhaps a different response to some extent than perhaps in some other European countries or Anglophone countries and so on. I think that's certainly part of it. Of course, that's a hypothesis that can only be tested up to a point, but nevertheless, I do think that those are factors. The second thing, if you look at the parties like Sinn Féin, I mean, kind of political scientists will say, oh, they have all the characteristics of a right-wing populist party, except that they're not a right-wing populist party. So again, basically, the sort of historic role of where basically a nationalist kind of party might be. I mean, Sinn Féin have taken an awful lot of their norms from basically, you know, UK and wider anti-racism and so on and so forth as well, anti-colonialism for certain. So they're not going to want to use that rhetoric either, you know. So I think there's a sort of an antipathy to some of the kind of moves that seem to play well in other countries, where basically I think that the stakes around being overtly nationalist or being nativist appear to be far less scary and far lower. That's all I say.
We've gone through all of our questions, but there's two issues that I want to raise, and I'd like to see if anyone wants to comment on these. And I want to raise them in the last 5 minutes here, if only to sort of acknowledge them as things that are happening at the moment. So the first one is what's happened on the DCU campus last week, which is, for those of you who might not know, the DCU lecturer in computer science, Mark Humphreys, who published a personal blog where he called George Floyd a thug and said that Black Lives Matter is, and I quote, nonsense built on sand. And, you know, there's been a whole fallout of this, and his defense of this racist statement has been incredibly problematic as well, because he's refused to back down, and he said that he leaves his political views at the door before stepping into class. And you know, the DCU response has been quite tepid as well, disappointingly tepid, but not surprising. But the other issue that I would also like us to acknowledge, because we've talked about race and migration, and we've kind of skirted around the issue of Fortress Europe, is the crisis unfolding on the borders of Poland and Belarus, which I think isn't talked about enough despite its severity. And there's a kind of cultural and political anesthesia where it occupied the headlines for a few days and then was just buried. And even then, the severity of it wasn't really acknowledged or condemned in the way that I would have liked. So anyway, I'd like to see if any of you want to talk about that, because these are things that are happening right now, and I'm sure that our audience would like to hear about this as well.
Right, I'll bite on the DCU question. I would be very, very concerned that somebody's personal political views, however reprehensible, you know, would basically be taken into which would shape their future on the university in terms of. We had Dolores Cahill in UCD, a figure I disagree with tremendously, but eventually she and UCD parted ways. Now, in Dolores Cahill's case, she was basically a medic, basically making various statements about COVID and medicine that were deeply problematic. And without knowing the ins and outs of how that case progressed, I can only imagine that they were a factor. In other words, she's an expert in medicine, and therefore, basically, I could imagine that there were real issues there to address, amongst other issues. Right. You know, the things that protected Dolores Cahill otherwise, or protect the guy in DCU, are things that protect all of us. And I think basically we would have to be quite careful about how we move forward there. There's a lot to lose as well. Yes, you can object to somebody's political views very trenchantly. Let me put it clearly on record that I have looked at this guy's posts. He makes bad arguments that other people have made far better, and those people are also making bad arguments, in my view. That's my opinion. But basically, if they have nothing to do with his own teaching, they are basically merely his personal opinion as a citizen, he must be allowed them. He must be allowed them, in my view. And that doesn't mean that people can't protest those views and so on and so forth. But we have to have a certain degree of robustness here, because otherwise we can't countenance those bad ideas. Now, you know, that would be my view in a nutshell.
Could I just say that I would feel really concerned as a student if I had to step into a class of a lecturer who publishes stuff like that on Black Lives Matter. I would not.
But even if he's teaching you computer science or maths or something that's got nothing to do with those ideas by which he seems to know patently very little about, but basically the idea that you don't feel safe just because somebody has a different views than you, that's not something that I would sort of see as sufficient. You know,
Gavin.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really tricky one, as you said, and I mean, I see where Bryan is coming from about the role of academics. I would disagree, is that these are not simply the private views of a citizen. He published them on a blog to have political effect and to have public engagement. Let's have to be very careful speaking about this particular person. But let's say the style of engagement is that of a troll, an ideological troll of a certain kind, and trolls can't really complain when the boomerang, does its turn. But which I mean by that, this is somebody who's been writing very personally about people and their political views in ways for a very long time, and has done that to draw attention to himself. It's very clear from the student protest that students now in different ways feel empowered to understand their relationship with their lecturer in the way that you have outlined, Pranav, which is that, yes, this is not strictly a question of academic freedom in the sense of what he's teaching in the classroom, but neither is it simply the relationship between two private citizens, because this is somebody who makes it clear that he is in the public domain to circulate racist views. Therefore, as a racialized student, for me, it's not a question of, sometimes we talk about the notions of feeling safe as if there's somehow, the response to this is some kind of is resilience, or it reminds me of the debates about sort of Muslims shouldn't be offended when somebody decides to, you know, draw another set of caricatures of the Prophet. They're doing that to get a political response. And the response that people give, which is flattened to the notion of being offended, could be, you know, feeling threatened, feeling, you know, menaced in their personal life and in their professional life and in their space of education, feeling, you know, politically agitated and antagonistic to the lecturer. So I don't think we can find terms that are derived from the sort of, you know, normal ways in which we think of sort of the public-private divide, civic and civil discussion, to understand the kinds of political dynamics that are taking shape around this. I agree. Particularly in the context of universities, you know, which are only too happy to find ways to increase control over research and to increase control over staff, be that through forms of control or be that through the form of control that precarious labor provides in the university. There's lots of ways in which we have to be very careful as to how outlier cases where ideologically we're opposed to those people can provide forms of institutional control that, you know, weaken academic freedom, weaken the position of, you know, organized labor in the university and all of that kind of thing. But I think we cannot have any discussion of universities as a community in any meaningful way unless the ways in which students are mobilizing around the fact that we do not accept that there's a division. There's a division in academic labor between what you teach us and what you write about, but there isn't a division in the political agency that you bring into the classroom. And therefore, that's where the debate has to be. And I think that one of the things that we must absolutely resist, and we've seen that a lot in the UK recently, is that students then become, because students protest, which is absolutely their democratic right on campus, and God knows we could see and handle a lot more protests on Irish campus in relation to a lot of issues. But it's very, very easy to frame, and I'm not suggesting that that's been done here, not at all, but I'm talking about in the UK, it's a blood sport to go after the students when the students say, you know, I can think of the equivalent here but it's a worst case, is someone like Eric Kaufman in Birkbeck, for example, who is basically peddling a polite society version of great replacement theory. And students of color in that university are saying, how can you expect us to sit there and simply objectively take social theory from a person that thinks that, you know, we and our parents have basically, you know, shouldn't be in the polity. So I think it's a very, very complex one to close the discussion with. But I think we're going to see more of these kinds of cases. Yeah. And therefore, I think we have a lot of thinking to do. But I mean, I know for sure where my solidarity lies in this one, and it's with the students, and it's with their sense of why this is a form of political agency that has to be faced down.
Absolutely. And Rona, could I just get you to make a final comment on either this or the crisis in Belarus, and we're going to end on that note because we would already go more time.
Okay, well, just very briefly, like I think it's very worrying that we are becoming desensitized to those scenes that we're seeing on television and in the media very, very regularly now, and it's very worrying because migration, as I said it earlier on, is something that we're going to see more of with climate change and with other things. With climate change in particular, we're going to see more people on the move, and the way it's been dealt with now is well, it's horrendous and it's heartbreaking, and I think it's one of the things that, speaking from a trade union perspective, one of the reasons why we've been talking about organising migrant labour in our countries and in Europe and across the world is that, you know, we have to start levelling the playing field for people because and organising people. And, you know, not allowing this sort of dehumanizing people to continue, because we're seeing a horrendous loss of life and it should be unacceptable.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks. And yeah, thank you to everyone for coming. We're gonna conclude on this note. Thanks to all our speakers for the valuable thoughts and for this productive discussion. Even if I decided to take it off the deep end towards the end. But thanks to the Irish Research Council, to the Crosscare Migrant Project, to Musi, and to Barry for organizing this. We'll see you all at the next one. Thanks everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.